Good morning, everyone. Prof, I'm very touched. I'm not that much of a narcissist. When they asked me to send through my profile, I indicated that there is a summarized version on the top. So sorry to have put everybody through that. When I reflect on some of the things you said this morning, particularly about the role that Unisa has played in the development of Africa's leaders, I reflect on two particular leaders that played a big role in the democratization of South Africa, particularly Ahmed Kathrada, also known as Mr. Kathy. He was one of the members on the Rivonia trial, and what touches me about him was that he was an Indian young man at the time, a youth, just like we are right now. And alongside Nelson Mandela and Tambo and the rest, he was willing to face a possible death penalty. If you looked at him, at his stature, he seemed like a very innocent person. I remember going to Constitution Hill and looking at the cells that these people were held in. It was really a place for very, very tough people. And these guys were young, learned enthusiasts, not criminals, but they were willing to face those possible futures for the sake of you and I today. Ahmed Kathrada, alongside Nelson Mandela, also studied through Unisa, got his first degree with us. I also think of Anton Lembede, Muzwak. What people don't realize, particularly when we speak about the ANC Youth League today, is that this man, who was the founder of the Youth League, in times when young Africans were not allowed to study, by the age of 29, he had a master's in philosophy from the University of South Africa. And it was upon that foundation that the Youth League was formed. Now, if you speak to many young leaders today and you ask about the ethos of the founder of such an organization, you're not likely to hear those kind of things. So my point is, when we speak about youth leadership in the African context and what we're here to achieve over the next 4 weeks, I want us to think of such leaders, and I want us to think of the monumental role that this institution has played. Before I really get into the meat of my talk, I'd like to reflect on an overarching guiding framework that's going to guide my discussion today. And that's the African Union's Agenda 2063. Many of us should be aware of it, but I feel it's important for us to reflect on it because it's our continental strategy. And it's the strategy that is meant to ensure that Africa's resources are used to benefit African people. Agenda 2063 has got 7 key aspirations that I want us to reflect on. Now, I know there's different tracks in this program. There's 3 different tracks. Some of us are in public and civic leadership, entrepreneurship. But within those 3 broad tracks, whatever we do, whether it's in the public sector, whether it is as entrepreneurs, or whether it's as civil servants or leaders of non-profit organizations, we are definitely going to be touching on one of these areas. The first aspiration is a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. That's definitely my area. That's something I'm passionate about. That's where my research touches on. The second one speaks of an integrated continent, politically united and based on the ideals of Pan-Africanism and the vision of an African Renaissance. The third one is an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. Fourth is a peaceful and secure Africa, where our children and where our families are free to walk on the motherland without having to continuously look over their shoulder for fear of some form of violence. The fifth one is an Africa with a strong cultural identity, common heritage, values, and ethics. The sixth, an Africa where development is people-driven unleashing the potential of its women and its youth. And the last one is Africa as a strong, united, and influential global player and partner. So, I mean, some key words come to mind there. We've heard about sustainable development. We heard about women and youth. We heard about peace, political unity. These are just some of the things that I think affect whatever we're going to go out having learned from this program and do. And so in the African context, when we speak about leadership, I mean, there's many different approaches or perspectives of leadership, many of which we're going to be learning over the next 4 weeks. And many of which I believe, because we are readers, something we've read about before: servant leadership, transformational leadership, situational leadership, authentic leadership, etc., etc. One of the big leadership philosophies that have played a key role, or that are very applicable to the South African context, is collaborative leadership, which is underpinned, of course, by the spirit of Ubuntu, right? There is a very interesting anecdote that we used to use when I was at the African Leadership Group on demonstrating the power of collaborative leadership, utilizing an example from nature. It's pretty common, so many of you might have heard it before. But for those who haven't heard it, it reflects on the flight of birds, namely geese, right? It's a powerful one, isn't it? And what it illustrates is that this collective of geese, of birds, as they fly, they take an approach to leadership and unity that results in a very strong collaborative leadership that's not centered around one individual. One of the first things that they do and that we can learn from nature is that the birds fly in a V formation, as we've all seen when we look up, right? And by flying in a V formation, what happens is that they are lined one after another. And so the bird in front of the last bird, when they flap their wings, they create an uplift. So they create a momentum. So it makes the bird behind the other one, it makes it easier for it to fly. This, in turn, increases their flight efficiency by 71%, rather than when they were flying alone. And the first lesson we can take from that is, by moving in the same direction in a coordinated effort, we are more likely to get there quicker, faster, more efficiently. Secondly, what happens is that when a bird leaves the cohort, it immediately feels the wind resistance. And by nature's law, it is forced to come back and join the rest of the group. If we stand united, those who wish to reduce our efforts to nothing, like unfortunately some of our leaders are doing in the present day, will feel it that it's not possible to stand against the majority. But for as long as we remain fragmented, and for as long as we as young people are not speaking out against leadership injustices, and we're all concerned with our own little lives in our corners, it's very easy for leaders to do what they do. We need to remain united. The third and most amazing lesson, which I think is very applicable to the African context, is that the birds at the end are benefiting from the uplift of all the birds in front of them. But the one in front is the one that's facing the wind. So it's bound to get tired along the journey. And when it gets tired, it simply drops back and comes to the back, and another bird takes over the leadership. I think that point speaks for itself, isn't it? Yeah? We need to learn to lead and share leadership. This thing of holding on to power, until we're in a casket, it's not going to take us anywhere. It's not going to take us anywhere. The fourth point is that when one of the geese get sick, tired, I'm sure you've seen people usually hunt them as well. Okay, so people will shoot them and play games and all kinds of different things. When one gets injured, sick, tired, or it's elderly, and it can no longer fly at the same pace of the group, another cohort of healthier geese will break away with it and fly with it until it recovers or dies. And that speaks to our ability to stick with each other, even when we are weak, through thick and thin, and when the going gets tough. And the last lesson which I'd like to draw from is that in order to keep at the same pace and to ensure that they're moving together, they often honk, sort of make this honking sound, to let one another know that we're here, we're together, we're with one another. And that speaks to an open form of communication, where we speak openly with one another and we remind each other that we're in this together. Now, this anecdote or example speaks to the kind of Africa that we want, right? Which is the theme, or which is the main crux of Agenda 2063. It's under the theme, the Africa we want. Recently, I had the pleasure of being at the African Young Graduates and Scholars Conference. We had young African scholars from all over the continent come together to share ideas in different fields under this theme. And we had a track that spoke about arts and heritage and culture. I believe that is aspiration number 5, isn't it? A strong cultural heritage, ethics and values, cultural unity. So the question in this track, it was led largely by artists. And the question was, how do we celebrate African culture, African music, song, dance, African wear, traditions, and how do we make sure that Africans can live by it? How do we monetize African arts? How do we monetize African traditions? How do we monetize African indigenous knowledge systems? And one of the questions that came to my mind as we were discussing, because we were sitting in this auditorium and everybody had either an iPhone or Samsung or something like that. And people were working on computers that were probably designed in the West, manufactured in the East. And we're sitting there and talking about this African, And one of the things that I said was that the biggest problem we have, particularly when we have dialogues around this, is that we haven't linked Africanization or being African to value. In other words, it's an ideal and an inspiring ideal, right? But when we then leave the auditoriums, we seek value in cars made in Switzerland or Germany, right? Gadgets, right? Made somewhere else. And, it really reminds me of when I go home to Venda and I go and see my grandmother. There's this one time I will never ever forget. It had been a long time. I went home to Venda and she was awaiting for us as a grandchildren to come home. And so, I get home and I ask, where's my grandmother? And she's around the back. So I go around the back. And this is a perfect example of how these different worlds meet. I go around the back and I immediately notice on the trees hanging a skinned lamb. And a few meters away, she's sitting there with 2 buckets, okay? And there was a very, very pungent smell coming from this. So I go to see my grandmother and I greet her in our traditional greeting, And she says, no, sit down, my son. And I noticed that what she's doing is what they call tripe, maguru, she's cleaning out the insides of this lamb so she can prepare this for us later. Now there are flies buzzing everywhere, and she has no problem with it. There's no need for Dettol. There's no need for, how are you? How's life? How's work? And these things are And so in that moment, I realized, oh my goodness, I've got to embrace this. So I sit down and I calm down, I let the flies. I tell her, no, work is fine, everything is okay. And she wants three things whenever she sees us. She wants either Tommy's, a towel, or airtime, so she can speak to her grandchildren. Those are only three things she wants. And she does not care whether the airtime was bought through Vodacom or MTN, and she does not care whether the technology to facilitate that was developed in Japan or Vietnam or China. She wants the value. You understand what I'm saying? She doesn't care whether Tommies were manufactured in South America, or she wants the Tommies. And my point is that until we can go home and say, Grandmom, here is your airtime. You are receiving it because I'm an expert in African dance. And it's giving you value. Right? Here are your Tommies. You are receiving them because I specialize in African philosophy. And because of this, here is your value. Until we can tie value to Africanization, this whole thing of an African ideal remains an inspiring but impractical ideal. Are we together? So we need to be able to look and find value. Where is the value? And this is what we're doing here. All the ideas that we have, all the ideas that you have, how are you going to make them valuable for you and the communities that you're going to be serving? As in really valuable. How is it going to impact their livelihoods? These are important questions that we need to answer. In order to generate this value and to ensure that whatever we do has value, we ourselves need to first have value, right? And it needs to be real. It needs to be real. If you do not believe you have value inside, nothing you touch will really be of value. And I think this is the crux then of my talk today. On this issue of not having value, I augmented a quote by Steve Biko to speak to today's theme. And he said the following. He said, it becomes necessary to see the truth as it is if you realize that the only vehicle for change are these people who have lost their personality. The first step, therefore, is to make the African come to themselves, to pump back life into their empty shell, to infuse them with pride and dignity, to remind them of their complicity in the crime of allowing themselves to be misused. This is a heavy hitter, because Biko is reminding us that whatever problem exists, to some degree, we are part and parcel of it. Either by not speaking or by speaking. It's either action or inaction. We are part of the problem. And so what he's doing is he's reminding us to come back to ourselves and first have a sense of pride and dignity. And this is the message that I want to have to us as young leaders today. Where is your pride and dignity? If we do not have pride and dignity in our own views, in our own philosophies, in our own regions, in our own people, where will it come from? So with that said, there are just some key leadership lessons which I learned in my journey. As young people, when we're in the spaces, and you'll notice as you network with one another, you're surrounded by brilliance. Everyone is doing something brilliant. They're working here. They're doing this on the side. They're part of this NGO. They're volunteering, And it's a difficult time, particularly for this group of people, because there's expectations from your families for what you should be. At the same time, there's expectations from your country. Everybody's talking youth. Youth are the future of tomorrow. We're trying to start families. We're trying to raise children. We're trying to start careers. We're trying to make social impact. We're trying to finish education. And there's a tendency to be caught in a trap of this, just go, without taking the time to sit and reflect and apply yourself effectively. So my point today is about how we can be effective as leaders. And that comes back to what Biko was speaking about, self-knowledge. Each of us have a temperature. We've got a temperament. You know, as time goes on, you'll know, this one is the jokester of the group, this one is the quiet one. That one is always at the bar. You'll get to know each other, And it's important not just to be known by others, but for us to know ourselves so that we can apply ourselves effectively. So this brings me to the topic of leadership, temperament, and intelligence. David Keirsey wrote a book called Please Understand Me Too. Excellent book. I was reading it recently and it just sparked so many revelations. I thought, look, I need to share some insights from it with us today. He says, and I quote, "The kind of intelligent role enacted by a leader or follower is determined by temperament, and the degree of skill in that role is determined by practice." One great example I'd like to use of common great leaders that we know is Nelson Mandela and Mahatma Gandhi. Mandela had the spirit of a revolutionary within him, but he also had political intelligence, diplomacy. And he stuck to that approach when it came to his leadership. Gandhi was an idealist. He believed in spiritual principles, he believed in his religion, and he stuck to the principles of nonviolence in his leadership. Both of them were very effective, but because they knew themselves and stuck to themselves. Now, if we're going to sit here and allow the dominant discourses to tell us who we need to be, to tell us how we need to act, and we're going to suppress the authentic self, we're not going to be effective as leaders. I think we all agree we've got a big task ahead of us. Africa as a continent has got challenges, and we're facing a leadership challenge. And it necessitates courage. And there's no ways we're going to develop that courage by being inauthentic. It's not possible. There's no ways we're going to walk those roads wearing somebody else's shoes. So I'm going to talk about one or two temperaments. They're the high-level ones. Of course, human beings cannot be categorized into just 4 categories. But I'm going to talk about 4 just for the sake of being to the point. If you want more, I really do suggest you get the book, do the questionnaire, find out so much about yourself, and many things will become clear. When I was reading it, many leadership blunders that I've done over the time, it's been 8 years I've been in some youth structures, SRC, World Economic Forum, One Young World, it doesn't matter. But there's issues emerge, politics, goals, burnout, all these things happen. And I want to share that lesson from one fellow young leader to other young leaders to say, how do we ensure that we walk the whole 9 yards? Keirsey speaks about different kinds of leaders: the tactical leader, the diplomatical leader, the logical leader, and the strategic leader. So I'm going to start off with the tactical leader. See if you can pick yourself up anywhere here. He calls these the artisans. The artisans are the temperament with a natural ability to excel in the arts, and not only the fine arts, such as painting and sculpturing and dancing, music and theater, but also athletic, military, political, mechanical, and industrial arts, as well as the art of the deal in business. Artisan leaders negotiate with ease, and of all the types, they have the highest sense of immediate reality. So they're very grounded in what's real, what's immediate, what's now. They are called natural negotiators, but other names which might capture their style are troubleshooters, beach makers, because they're good at putting out fires, at untangling snarls, and at responding to crises in a way in which other types cannot really do. They are very utilitarian. Whatever needs to be done to solve a problem is done now. ties to the past or to the future are negotiable. Do we have any tactical leaders in the house? The diplomatic leader. These are also called idealists. Idealists are passionately concerned with personal growth and development. Idealists strive to discover who they are and how they become their best possible self. Always, this quest for self-knowledge and self-improvement drives their imagination. They want to help others make their journey. They are naturally drawn to working with people. And whether in education or counseling or in the social services or personnel work or in journalism, they are gifted at helping others find their way in life, often inspiring them to grow as individuals and fulfill their potentials. With a natural aptitude for working with people, idealist leaders are appropriately called the catalysts, because their talents as mentor and advocate enable them to energize productive human relations. They can draw out the best in people, and they are first and foremost people-oriented. That is, their focus is on the individuals within the organizations, regardless of their status. They are very personal in their transactions and tend to become committed to the progress of those around them, and they're forever alert to possibilities in others' growth. Do we have any diplomats in the house? Great. Second last is the logistical leader, also called the guardians. Guardians are the cornerstone of society, for they are the temperament given to serving and preserving our most intimate social institutions. Guardians have a natural talent in managing goods and services from supervision, maintenance, and supply, and they use all their skills to keep systems running smoothly. Whether it's in communities, schools, churches, public sector, hospitals, or businesses. The guardian leaders tend to have a stabilizing or consolidating effect on the organization that they're part of. They therefore can be called the stabilizers. Their abilities lie in establishing schedules, routines, roles, protocols, systems, methods. They are good at drawing up lines of communication and at following through on jobs until completion. They are patient, thorough, steady, reliable, and orderly. They value contracts, administrative regulations, and standard operating procedures. People in this category know that they can count on things remaining constant and familiar. They know that personnel and material and business agreements will all be kept. Do we have any guardians in the house? Where are our engineers? We've got a hand. And the last of all is the strategic leader. These are called the rationals. Rationals are the problem-solving temperament. Particularly if the problem has to do with the many complex systems in the world around us. Rationals tackle problems in organic systems, such as in the plant and animal kingdoms, or in mechanical systems, such as railroads, computers, or even social systems, such as families, organizations, and institutions. Whatever the system, rationals will analyze them to understand how they work so they can figure out how to make them work better. Thinking from a big picture and overall position. Rational leaders might be called visionary leaders because they have the ability to envision the goals of an organization and then to conceive strategic plans to implement these goals efficiently. They pride themselves on their ingenuity and technical know-how and want to use their innate understanding of factors to reduce the complex to the simple. They get models onto paper, they think in terms of pictures, and can reduce really fascinating concept to very simple, this is what must be done in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years for us to reach where we want to go. They rise to the challenges of design for increased efficiency And when they're called upon to deal with strategy, they go happily to work. Do we have any strategic leaders? Nice. So one thing, as I draw to a close, that I experienced was that we were on a strategic planning session with the global shapers of the Tshwane Hub. And I was sharing a room with the chairperson. And we wouldn't sleep. We were wondering about the program. We were concerned about this, about that, logistics, all the stuff. And one thing that made me learn a lot about myself was that this chairperson, Kopano, is still a very close friend of mine today and somebody I respect a lot. He was the type, we could stay up until 2, caucusing, talking, making things happen, planning, preparing, and he would be up at 5, energetically. Now me, on the other hand, look, if I don't get my 8 hours, it's a problem. And for me, my feet were dragging. It was really, really difficult to get through those 3 days. We did it over a weekend because I had to be awake. I had to be part of the discussions. I had to contribute. So I couldn't sleep early. But at the same time, I had to be up early and make sure everybody's, going in the right direction. And so that was a leadership challenge for me. And so for me to try and do things at Kopano's pace was not the wisest thing. Of course, that situation, I didn't have a choice. I had to. But I'm saying, in terms of going forward, learning about myself, realizing the amount of sleep I really need, and trying to structure my life in such a way that I get that sleep so I can be most effective was best. I later suffered from burnout, and for a while I had to step down from my position until I later rejoined the group. This is a very real situation. It reminds me of Ariana Huffington. When I was at the One Young World Summit, 2013, that was held in Johannesburg, she was giving us a talk. She's become an international sleep advocate. Because when she was building the Huffington Post, she got to a point where she was so sleep deprived that she passed out in her office, had a concoction, and had to go to the hospital. And that's what made her realize, my goodness, I need to sleep. So she's become this global sleep advocate, and she says, young people, sleep. Get more sleep. Look, as young leaders, my point is there are a lot of expectations on us. As I said, we're doing many things. New marriages, new relationships, new this, new that, new careers. And we've got to balance all of these things. My point is, if you are like Kopano and you can operate on 3 hours of sleep, do it. If you're like me, get your 8 hours. And if any of these temperaments have spoken to you, understand your temperament. If you're a people person, be careful of throwing yourselves into situations where you've got to demonstrate hard and fast authority, which tends to damage relationships, cause friction. And we've seen that a lot. Young leaders excel in something. They've got great skill, so they're promoted. We give you the position. And then when they're there, their lives fall apart, isn't it? I've seen this being a leadership development consultant. People used to come to our offices for one-on-ones. And my boss and I had a very good relationship. And though I wouldn't consult with the people, he would sit down and reflect with me and say, this general manager is going through this divorce because of this. This one had a miscarriage because of that. This one is in hospital because of stress. This one is this. And I really got to recognize that, in these organizations that we serve, sometimes we sell ourselves short by being inauthentic. So the crux of my message today is that if we're going to be effective leaders, and if this 4 weeks is going to count for anything, come out of this place knowing who you are. Be true to yourself. As Biko said, re-inject dignity and pride in who you are as an African. In Africa today. And let's realize in our discussions of Africanization that there's more to being African than simply having IP on an African approach to thinking. We're in a global world, and drawing on the skills and ideas of other people from around the world does not make us any less African. There was a time when the Roman Empire was it. Caesar was it, isn't it? Everybody, speaking Latin and Rome. And, no one ever thought that an empire would fall and diversity would come back and spring up again. And there's a time now where, Western hegemony seems to be it. Right? But this is not the end of the world. And a new era can come where generations down the line, people will say, there used to be this Western view, our UN, and, today it's different. So guys, be authentic, stick to yourselves, and let's lead. Africa needs us. Let's be authentic. Let's cut through the nonsense. We're young people. Paul Pullman, presidents, they're all saying the youth. 50% of our population, the youth. But we're not taking the baton and running with it. We're letting each other down. Let's be courageous. Let's lead. And let's know ourselves. Thank you very much.